Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wise Body Podcast, where we talk about eating disorder recovery and all things body. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Hughes. I bring 20 years of experience as an eating disorder therapist, and I've worked with hundreds of clients to feel more empowered and connected to their body by tapping into the wisdom it holds. I'm so excited to keep learning with you as we navigate the windy path that is recovery. So let's get started. Hi, and welcome to another solo episode hosted by yours truly. In this season 2, I thought I would offer some book reviews for fun. You may have heard me reference in previous podcasts that I gave up reading for a few years after grad school, but I've rediscovered my love for it, and so now it's just a matter of making the time with 2 small kids running around. Most books I choose are related to the eating disorder field because I just can't help it, and that's what I love to read. So let's get to it. Today, I thought I would review The Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating by Christy Harrison, who also, by the way, has an amazing podcast called Food Psych, and I highly recommend both. I thought I would break some of the book down by highlighting 5 wise points. I will make references to and quote or paraphrase The Anti-Diet through this episode. Here is my wise 5 for Christy Harrison's amazing book, The Anti-Diet. Number 1. First, Christy Harrison does a beautiful job talking about the roots of diet culture. She references 2 of the earliest known sculptures of the goddess Venus, which depict her as voluptuous and curvy. It's actually the oldest known figurative depiction of a human ever found. And interestingly, it was found recently in 2008 in Germany. The bigger body meant fertility, wealth, and status. In complete juxtaposition, however, were the religious preachings of the time, which warned against gluttony and responding by religious fasting so as to not compromise the soul. In ancient Greece and Rome, we see another contradiction, as there were conflicting beliefs that fatness was a sign of a malformed spirit, and yet Hippocrates said, "Those who are fat about the belly do best." Hippocrates also said not following the proper diet, which included reducing the amount of food when sick, which I don't see the logic there, and finding pleasure in food meant you were an uncivilized brute. Linguistically, in Greek and Latin, fat meant prosperity, and fertility and thin meant poor and weak. So clearly there was ambivalence then about what fat and thinness meant. After the fall of Rome, the notion that body fat needed to be cured went underground for a really long time. There were examples here and there during the Middle Ages that thinness was prized, but for the most part, there was no unified institutionalized stigma against larger bodies, not until recently. Moving along our timeline, during colonization, settlers often blamed indigenous foods for making them sick, even though they basically ate the same foods at every meal and without incident. This reinforced the notion of bad foods and also feeling like one is morally superior because of what they ate. Then, during the industrial age, gluttony was again thought to be evil. In the 1830s, there was a popular Presbyterian minister, Sylvester Graham, who preached about how spices, meat, sugar, caffeine, and alcohol led to things like indigestion, illness, and even sexual excess. Certain foods were seen as dangerous. It's important to note that Graham may have experienced his own childhood trauma, though that is for him to name. But he did lose his father at age 8 and had a mother who was mentally ill and not able to care for him or his siblings, who often bounced between neighbors' homes. So it was known that he grew up angry and bitter and exhausted, and so he thought his diet could cure him. And he limited himself to bran bread, rice, tapioca, and sago, which is a type of pudding made from palm flour, sauceless vegetables, and a few selected fruits. Some of his followers thought that this diet was too restrictive and that there was no way one would be able to survive on it. So in defense, Graham and some of his followers tracked their weights to prove that their weights would be maintained. And this is actually the first documented evidence of Americans tracking their weights. I want to pause and make a pretty bold statement here, and then I'll back it up. That is, body size is a classist, racist, and sexist issue. Let's look into this a little more. During industrialization, many in the middle class were looking for ways to assert domination over immigrants and used thinness as a marker of social status. Then there were white scientists, including Charles Darwin, who started to categorize people, noting those of the white Northern European descent as superior to the less civilized cultures, and found them also to be in larger bodies compared to their white counterparts. It's also to be noted that according to this categorization, white men were first and white women were second. And it's no coincidence that those doing this research were white men. This research bias is still found currently in science. A question to think about then is who is benefiting from this research? Often there's a financial gain involved. More on that later. Also, there's no coincidence that the first diet book in the 1860s was authored by a white man named William Banting, who was frustrated by his weight. He couldn't possibly be associated with being less than for being in a bigger body. So he found a doctor to put him on a really strict diet. Let me read a little bit about his diet and what he says about it. Banting's introduction reads a lot like many of today's diet books, old-timey language aside. Of all the parasites that affect humanity, I do not know of, nor can I imagine any more distressing than that of obesity. And having just emerged from a very long probation in this affliction, I am desirous of circulating my humble knowledge and experience for the benefit of my fellow man, with an earnest hope it may lead to the same comfort and happiness I now feel under the extraordinary change. In other words, he's saying, I got thin and it changed my life. Here's how you can do it too. Sound familiar? He also discussed the weight-related stigma he'd experienced in adulthood. I am confident no man laboring under obesity can be quite insensible to the sneers and remarks of the cruel and injudicious in public assemblies, public vehicles, or the ordinary street traffic, nor to the annoyance of finding no adequate space in a public assembly if he should seek amusement or need refreshment, and therefore he naturally keeps away as much as possible from places where he's likely to be made the object of taunts and remarks of others. Just as it is today, fatness was increasingly demonized in Banting's time, and larger-bodied people were the targets of exclusion and derision. It's no wonder he wanted to escape that fate. The diet he outlined in the pamphlet, which came to be known as the Banting diet, was low in carbs and high in meat and fat, sort of like a proto-Atkins diet, but with a lot more alcohol on the order of 6 glasses a day, apparently to help counteract the constipating effects of eating almost nothing but meat. Banting's book, with its obsessive logging of body weights, helped ignite a cultural obsession with the scale. When the book was first published, scales were a novelty item in the US. People would weigh themselves at regional fairs and exhibitions where manufacturers encouraged attendees to step on giant platform scales designed for agricultural and industrial uses, a publicity stunt meant to show just how accurate these scales were. They weren't really made for weighing people, and that was the fun of it. Banting's attention to weight helped change all that, creating a demand for scales that were more widely available and more finely calibrated for the human body. The first human scales were sold to healthcare facilities and were too cumbersome and expensive for use by most people. Then a technological innovation appeared that suddenly allowed people to start weighing themselves regularly. The penny scale, a coin-operated platform-style scale that was introduced in the US in 1885 and quickly spread through the country. Soon there were penny scales everywhere, in drugstores, train stations, grocery stores, and eventually even banks, movie theaters, and office buildings. The scales spread in part because they were so profitable for their manufacturers and owner-operators, bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue over the years. The proliferation of penny scales also fanned the flames of people's emerging painful self-consciousness about weight. Although interestingly, at first, the chief concern among women was being too thin, not too fat. So here comes the first diet and the first scale that is designed to weigh the human body. For women around the same time as the Banting diet, the Gibson Girl was created, and it changed the trajectory for women seeking thinness. Charles Dana Gibson drew a model that exemplified the Victorian ideal, a wealthy, hourglass-shaped and thin-waisted woman who could do stuff like ride a bike, play tennis, and croquet. It was a way to rebuke against the gender norms and the confines of Victorian womanhood that yet shackled her just the same, and that this ideal was not achievable as it was based on a drawing, similar to the way an airbrushed image is. It's not real. But women bought the idea and everything the Gibson Girl was selling, similar to the way modern-day models sell products. Number 2. Let's talk more about how dieting has become a problem. First, the problem is 65% of American women between 25 to 45 have some form of disordered eating, and 10% meet criteria for an eating disorder. This is likely an underestimation, as eating disorders are often underreported. For men, it's about half of that. And those who identify in the LGBTQ population are 2 to 4 times more likely to have an eating disorder compared to those identifying as cisgender. Dieting is the most potent political sedative in a women's history. It keeps us too hungry, too fixated on our bodies, and too caught up in the minutia of our eating regimens to focus our energies on changing the world. If we don't diet, we're thought to think that we won't have a good life. Clean eating or dieting is an endless vicious cycle because we receive the message that we're not trying hard enough when it doesn't work. We blame ourselves and not the diet, which is ironically hurting us, though we're told it's the right thing to do. And bad body image isn't cured by weight loss. Body image improves when your relationship to your body and food improves. Here's more about that. Diets lead to weight gain. Let me explain. Your body perceives restriction as dangerous. And so from an evolutionary perspective, diets feel like famine to the body. And our body just wants to be in a set point range, which is a weight range in which our bodies function best. Let me read a little bit about that. When you get cold, you shiver. That's how your body keeps you warm so that you can survive. And when you're restricted or deprived of food, your body turns up the food-seeking signals because it wants you to survive. It pumps out the hunger hormones, turns down the fullness hormones, and lowers your metabolic rate, all in the service of keeping you from starving. This isn't a failure of your mind to control your body. This is your body taking care of you. So the diet is meant to fail, so you blame yourself and try again, thereby funding diet companies and diet medications. Moving on to point number 3, the BMI scale and the obesity epidemic, both of which I hate. Let me read a little bit about that and then we'll dive in a little more. So around the turn of the 20th century, insurance companies started using height and weight tables inspired by the work of a Belgian astronomer and statistician named Adolf Quetelet, whose Quetelet index is now known as the body mass index, or BMI, to categorize people as normal weight, overweight, and underweight, with normal being considered ideal. There were and still are many problems with that equation. For one, Quetelet developed it in the 1830s as a way to test whether the laws of probability could be applied to human beings at the population level. It was created as a statistical exercise, not a medical instrument, and was never intended for clinical use. Quetelet also developed his equation using an exclusively white European population, the people in his environment, which means that it doesn't account for differences in average body size in other ethnic groups. None of these flaws stopped the insurance companies from using variations of the Quetelet index, though. In 1899, there was a medical director who presented some preliminary data from several insurance companies stating that From our mortality records, the overweights are clearly less desirable than either the normal or the underweights. These records were based almost exclusively on wealthy white men, but modern-day data from much larger, more representative samples shows that the overweights actually have the lowest mortality risk of any group on the BMI chart. The BMI is also notoriously imprecise. It can't tell you anything about a body's composition, nor can it accurately predict their health outcomes. Indeed, many researchers over the years have recommended that BMI be discarded as an outdated and ineffective tool for measuring health. I'm just going to repeat a few points here. So the BMI scale was never meant to be a diagnostic tool. It doesn't take into account body composition such as muscle or bone density, race, ethnicity, or older age. And it was originally based on measurements for white men. It simplifies health into one number, which isn't an accurate way to define what is healthy versus unhealthy. Blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin, fitness level, mental health, and lifestyle all matter. BMI is being misused. So much so that in my experience, it could determine treatment length of stay as insurance over-focuses on BMI when it comes to eating disorders. I'm going to read a little bit more about BMI. It's a big topic. So a little bit about the beginning of what's referred to as the obesity epidemic. So in 1998, millions of Americans became overweight and obese literally overnight. There was a federal governing body in charge of setting the official BMI categories for American guidelines, and it released a report changing its thresholds for what's considered overweight and obese. People suddenly moved into new, higher BMI categories without having gained any weight whatsoever, simply because the cutoffs had changed. So this governing body is really meant to be an unbiased organization devoted to public health. Yet the reality of how these cutoffs were established is quite political, as we can see by tracing their origins. This governing body consulted a task force, which was largely funded by two pharmaceutical companies that make weight loss drugs. The task force's purpose was to lobby for and create science that supports the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. And of course, lowering BMI cutoff so that millions more Americans think they have a weight problem is definitely in the interest of pharmaceutical companies selling weight loss drugs. A political scientist named J. Eric Oliver put it simply and put it really well in his 2000 book called Fat Politics. It is difficult to find any major figure in the field of obesity research who does not have some type of financial tie to a pharmaceutical or weight loss company. Just a little bit more. I'm going to read a little more. Aside from the incentives they were getting from the diet industry, obesity researchers had their own stake in lowering the BMI thresholds because it increased the perceived importance of their work, giving them more opportunities to get funding, as well as increased power and prestige. And soon enough, the budgets for obesity programs jumped from about $50 million in 1993 to $400 million in 2004. By adding nearly 40 million people to the numbers supposedly at risk because of their weight, the governing body elevated obesity to a level of public health importance it had never had before. Moving on to my next point, number 4. So Christy Harrison, she references a weight loss study that essentially said weight loss works. And the researchers, by the way, were receiving funding by several drug companies who had a vested interest as it helped promote their weight loss drugs, as we noted previously with the BMI scale. The researchers of this study collected thousands of success weight loss stories, but that N was actually representative of only a very small percentage of all dieters. Then a follow-up counter study found that 95 to 98% of those success weight loss stories, that those people actually regained their lost weight and maybe more within a 5-year period. The International Journal of Eating Disorders put out an article referencing this study and said that there were remarkable parallels between those participants of that research study who had successfully lost weight and those who have chronic anorexia nervosa, thereby saying both of these groups in the research study and those with anorexia were really living their lives dominated and plagued by the pursuit of thinness. For my last and final point, number 5, weight stigma is worse for your health than what you actually eat. Let me read from Christy Harrison about this and what she says. She says, weight stigma can contribute to health problems in a number of ways. Perhaps the most obvious one is that it's stressful to be stigmatized for your size, and stress takes a physical toll on your body. The scientific term for this toll is allostatic load, meaning the cumulative effect of chronic stressors on multiple systems in the body, the cardiovascular system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and metabolism. Because it looks at the entire body rather than isolated parts, allostatic load has been shown to be a more robust predictor of chronic disease than any other markers. And the research is clear that weight stigma has seriously detrimental whole body effects. One study that followed close to 1,000 participants for 10 years found that those who reported experiencing significant weight stigma over that period were twice as likely to have a high allostatic load as those who didn't, regardless of actual BMI. In other words, weight stigma is an independent risk factor for physiological stress. What's more, the researchers in this study found that the health risks posed by weight stigma are greater than what the researchers called poor quality dietary patterns, in diet culture's terms, eating bad foods. I repeat, weight stigma has been shown to pose a greater risk to your health than what you eat. Wanted to end with a pretty powerful quote from the anti-diet. And that is, the food movement considers itself socially progressive, yet it intentionally upholds an outmoded, racist, oppressive view of bodies by accepting and repeating obesity epidemic rhetoric, blaming particular foods for supposedly making people fat. It's time to stop blaming bad or unhealthy foods, and it's time to stop blaming our bodies, which are designated to take care of us. I hope you enjoyed listening to some of my takeaways from Christy Harrison's The Anti-Diet. Go grab your own copy, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen in this week. I'm so glad you're here with me as we learn more from our wise bodies and about eating disorder recovery. For more, follow me on social media, and please share the Wise Body podcast with your friends. Lastly, if you're interested in a free client consultation, please reach out on drhughes.com. And remember, always take care of yourself and your temple. See you next time on the Wise Body podcast.